There's been speculation over whether any members of Donald Trump's current cabinet will make their own presidential runs in 2028. Several of his cabinet members have made previous attempts at the presidency or are public figures in their own right. Based on the history of cabinet members or former cabinet members becoming president, let alone presidential candidates, it seems very unlikely. The last time the United States had a president who'd previously served in the cabinet of another president was with Herbert Hoover. He'd served as Secretary of Commerce to Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Hoover was elected in 1928, meaning that, unless someone with cabinet experience is elected in 2028, it will be 100 years since the nation elected one as president. This discussion of cabinet members is specifically referring to the 15 department heads, such as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Attorney General, and doesn't include vice presidents or cabinet-level positions, both of which will be discussed later. While it's rare to see anyone from these offices become president, it's almost just as rare to see them become presidential candidates. The most recent was in 2016. Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton had served as Secretary of State during Barack Obama's first term. However, prior to her, the most recent was, once again, Herbert Hoover. It isn't uncommon, however, that the reverse happens. That is, presidential candidates becoming cabinet members. As mentioned, Donald Trump's cabinet contains multiple former candidates. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had competed against Trump for the 2016 Republican nomination. Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum did the same in 2024. Also, in 2024, Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ran as an independent candidate. There are other recent examples beyond Trump's cabinet. John Kerry was the 2004 Democratic presidential candidate, and later served as Barack Obama's second Secretary of State. Pete Buttigieg contended with Joe Biden for the 2020 Democratic nomination and then served as Biden's Secretary of Transportation. And Hillary Clinton contended with Barack Obama for the 2008 Democratic nomination prior to serving in his cabinet. Between Hoover and Clinton, there have been cabinet members and former cabinet members who've attempted to receive their party's nominations. John Connally in 1980, Alexander Haig in 1988, and Bill Richardson in 2008, all performed poorly and dropped out during the primary process. Going back further, in 1952, Harry Truman's Secretary of Commerce, W. Averell Harriman, ran for the Democratic Party nomination, received Truman's backing, and performed well in early balloting. However, Truman eventually persuaded him to drop out of the race so his support could go to another candidate. In 1940, before it became clear that Franklin D. Roosevelt was going to run a third time, his Postmaster General, James Farley, attempted to win the Democratic Party nomination. He gained some traction, but once it became clear that Roosevelt was effectively in the race, Farley's chances were wiped out. It's worth noting that some do consider George Bush to have essentially been a cabinet member, as he served as the Director of Central Intelligence under Gerald Ford. However, this is officially considered a cabinet-level position, rather than a full cabinet position. In some ways, cabinet-level officials are like cabinet members, such as their selection process. However, there are also differences. Cabinet-level officials are not in the presidential line of succession and are not necessarily officers of the United States. Some also note that Franklin D. Roosevelt had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. However, this wasn't a cabinet position or even a cabinet-level position. Presidents with cabinet experience weren't always so rare. Of the 45 men to serve as United States President, 8 were former cabinet members. Of these 8, 6 served as Secretary of State, 2 as Secretary of War, and 1 as Secretary of Commerce. The discrepancy comes from the fact that James Monroe briefly served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. In the first 52 years of presidential history, a cabinet position, In particular, the Secretary of State position was seen as one of the best stepping stones to the presidency. 5 of the first 8 presidents had served as Secretary of State. It started with Thomas Jefferson, who'd served as the Secretary of State for George Washington. The next 3 presidents, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, were all serving as Secretary of State when first elected president. After the 2 terms of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, who'd served as Jackson's Secretary of State, was elected. After Van Buren, there was a sharp drop-off in cabinet members ascending to the presidency, with only 3 more spread out over 88 years. 20 years after Van Buren, James Buchanan was elected. 52 years after Buchanan, William Howard Taft was elected, and 20 years after Taft, Herbert Hoover was elected. It's also worth noting that Ulysses S. Grant had served as acting Secretary of War for 5 months. However, this was never an official or permanent position. There's been speculation as to what caused the drop-off of cabinet members becoming president. It seems to somewhat align with the change in how parties nominated candidates. In the early years of presidential history, candidates were nominated via congressional caucuses. This meant that members of Congress belonging to the major parties held their own meetings and nominated their party's candidate. This began to change in the late 1820s, when the modern political parties and party conventions were born, partly in response to complaints about the selection process not being democratic enough. In this system, rather than members of Congress selecting the candidates, it would be done by a much larger group of delegates. These quickly developed a communal and festive atmosphere with large get-togethers, campaign songs, slogans, parades, and items branded with candidates' names. In the elections following this change, 3 of the Whig Party candidates were famed war heroes, and 2 of them went on to win the presidency. Zachary Taylor, who won the 1848 election, defeated Lewis Cass, a former Secretary of War. Taylor had no prior political experience, making him a stark contrast from the likes of Madison, Monroe, and Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams once commented on the popular appeal of war heroes, quote, "Military achievement is very visible and has palpable merit." Adams was speaking in reference to Andrew Jackson, his 2-time election rival for the presidency. Both Quincy Adams and Jackson had served the nation significantly, but Jackson was much more popular with common Americans. In their second contest for the presidency, Quincy Adams was defeated by Jackson by a large margin, perhaps making him the new election system's first victim. By that election, almost every state had expanded its voting demographic beyond simply property-owning white males to the general population of adult white males. Historian, professor, and author H.W. Brands also discussed the issue and highlighted the importance of a candidate's ability to get votes rather than simply their experience. Quote, "Secretaries of State, who often climbed the appointive ladder rather than the elective ladder, were untested and therefore risky. Their dearth as nominees and then presidents had little to do with their diplomatic skills. It had much more to do with their absence of political chops." This change in the election procedures is the most often discussed when it comes to the drop-off in cabinet members ascending to the presidency. But there are other potential factors. For example, since all of the early cabinet members to become president were former secretaries of state, it's possible it was only this position, rather than a cabinet position in general, that was a stepping stone to the presidency. The Secretary of State is considered the president's chief diplomat to foreign nations and his main advisor on foreign matters. In the nation's early years, diplomacy was crucial to its survival. Furthermore, opinions on foreign nations, in particular Great Britain and France, were defining features of the first 2 political parties in America. Over the years, the nation gained a more stable footing. Its immediate survival wasn't as reliant on foreign affairs, and internal issues could take higher precedence. Perhaps the secretaries of state simply weren't viewed as having the most relevant experience to solve the nation's most pressing problems. Another possibility is that the selection of cabinet members as candidates, and in particular secretaries of state, had less to do with the intrinsic value of the office and more to do with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was, of course, the first Secretary of State to later serve as president, and the next two, Madison and Monroe, had both been personally mentored by Jefferson. John Quincy Adams could also be considered a protege of Jefferson, though to a lesser extent. Perhaps this road to the presidency was something more exclusive to Jefferson and his method of gaining political power. Regardless of the reason, the drop-off was drastic and sudden. It seems obvious in hindsight that after Van Buren, a cabinet position wouldn't be an obvious path to the presidency. But this wasn't obvious to everyone at the time. For the next 2 decades, ambitious men would still seek cabinet positions, and then the presidency. Men with impressive presidential resumes, such as Secretaries of War John C. Calhoun and Lewis Cass, and Secretaries of State Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, would all seek the presidency, and all fail to achieve it. Decades after Quincy Adams' defeat, the nation elected former Secretary of State James Buchanan. This wasn't a mandate by the American people to return to old habits. Buchanan was nominated by the Democrats as a compromise candidate, and without much enthusiasm. Today, Buchanan is commonly referred to as the worst United States president. Some even say that the office of Secretary of State was cursed after his presidency so that no one who held the position could ever be elected again. After Buchanan, the only Secretaries of State to become major party candidates were James G. Blaine in 1884 and Hillary Clinton. Hoover and Taft were Secretaries of Commerce and War, respectively, but their election victories certainly didn't lead to any trends of cabinet members becoming president, but rather appeared to be anomalies. A trend that did end up emerging was cabinet positions being awarded to presidential contenders. As mentioned, new presidents will often award cabinet positions to those who had competed for the party's nomination or run in previous elections. Most notable for this was Abraham Lincoln. Of his initial cabinet lineup, 4 of the 7 men were rivals who'd contended with him for the Republican nomination. There are many other examples. James Garfield, Secretary of State James G. Blaine, had been one of the main contenders for the Republican Party nomination until Garfield was settled on as a compromise candidate. Grover Cleveland, Secretary of the Treasury John G. Carlisle, is believed to have dropped out of the running in 1892 due to the promise of a cabinet position. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, had been the Democratic Party candidate in 3 previous presidential elections. And more recently, Richard Nixon's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, George Romney, had been a contender for the 1968 Republican Party nomination. The discussion thus far has excluded vice presidents, who have always held an interesting relationship to the cabinet. For most of the nation's history, the vice president only served on the cabinet by statute. However, the vice president's role as a more official cabinet member became established throughout the 20th century. The vice president still doesn't head a department of his own, like the other cabinet members, and is elected rather than appointed. But vice presidents now do attend regular cabinet meetings. Since the vice president assumed a more prominent role, 3 vice presidents, or former vice presidents, have ascended to the presidency via election. Donald Trump's second vice president, J.D. Vance, has been viewed as a potential contender for the 2028 election. Based on recent history, he might have a good chance of at least becoming his party's nominee. In the last 70 years, numerous vice presidents and former vice presidents have become their party's candidate. 3 of the last 6 Democratic presidential candidates were either sitting or former vice presidents. The second half of the 20th century saw a notable rise in vice presidents running, with sitting Vice President Hubert Humphrey and former Vice President Richard Nixon being the main contenders in the 1968 election. This is actually in contrast to much of the nation's history. Like with the office of Secretary of State, the vice presidency was seen as an ideal stepping stone to the presidency. However, it would drop off around the same time. Not counting vice presidents who ascended to the presidency upon the death of their predecessor, Martin Van Buren would be the last vice president elected until Richard Nixon in 1968. Unlike the cabinet positions, the vice president traditionally had little power behind the scenes and little public prominence, being derided as a useless office by many who held it. However, since Richard Nixon's vice presidency in the 1950s, many vice presidents have not only taken more active roles in their administrations, but have also had greater public visibility. When Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race in 2024, there was virtually no discussion of whether cabinet members such as Gina Raimondo should become the party's new candidate. By contrast, Vice President Kamala Harris was immediately viewed by many as the natural successor. It's likely the public at large wasn't familiar with Raimondo, whereas Harris was a familiar name and face. Even though cabinet members traditionally have a much larger role in a president's administration, they seem to generally be viewed as background actors without distinct media personalities or presences, with some exceptions. Even a figure such as Biden's Secretary of State Antony Blinken, generally considered a key decision-maker in the administration, wasn't viewed as a potential successor. Even supporters of his actions as Secretary of State generally don't seem to push for his candidacy, seeing him as unappealing to the public at large and better as working in a cabinet position. However unlikely it seems now that a cabinet member should become the next president, it is worth noting that presidential history has taken some unexpected turns that only seem obvious in hindsight. Just one example of this is how certain Americans once were that their presidents would descend from cabinet positions. With a solid streak of presidents from Jefferson to Quincy Adams, it might have seemed like a foregone conclusion that the majority of presidents going forward would be former secretaries of state, and for many years, notable men of American politics coveted the office, believing it to be a stepping stone, only to later lose the general election or fail to even become a candidate. In that same way, perhaps the United States could be undergoing historical changes with election patterns that will only seem obvious decades later. Despite the seeming unlikelihood, perhaps the nation could suddenly elect a president with cabinet experience for the first time in 100 years. If you enjoyed this video, consider browsing the channel for other videos on United States presidents, all the way from George Washington to modern presidents, discussing their political careers, personal lives, and places in history.